Thanks.
So thank you again, everyone, for joining us for the AR Emerging Architecture Awards Live. My name is Ellen Pearson, and I'm one of the editors of the Architectural Review. I'm going to start with a few of the duller housekeeping things before we get on to the fun bit. If I could ask everyone in the audience to mute themselves throughout, and except at the end if you're asking a question. And then panelists, if you could keep yourself muted whenever you're not speaking. It would also be really great if everyone, panelists and audience, could turn on their cameras, and then we can feel like we might actually be in the same room. Although we're not all together, it's really incredible to be here across borders and time zones and to celebrate those at the beginning of their career in architecture. And in particular, the 15 practices shortlisted for the AR Emerging Architecture Awards. As part of these celebrations, we have brought these brilliant emerging architects together in conversations to discuss what it means to start a career in architecture in different parts of the world, the challenges you face and how you overcome them. Together, this series of conversations will form an Emerging Architect's Guide, a collection of advice and experience for new architects and students all over the world. In this conversation, I'm delighted to introduce firstly, the award-winning Karls and Enrich Studio, based in Barcelona. And then we have Arigho Larmour Wheeler, based in Ireland. Nomos, based between Portugal, Switzerland, and Spain. Studio Propolis, between Kenya and the UK. And Surman Weston, based in the UK. So to kick off, we asked each practice to prepare a 3-point Emerging Architect's Guide, answering these 3 questions. Number 1, what advice would you give yourself as an architecture student that you weren't told then but know now? Number 2, what is an important lesson you have learned about being an emerging architect, specifically where you are in the world? And number 3, what's the best piece of advice you have been told and by whom? We will ask them to present these shortly. We will then share our stories and anecdotes and ask each other questions and advice. So if the audience would like to pop any questions you might have for the architects in the chat at the bottom of your Zoom screen, either for everyone to see, or if you're feeling shy, you can send it to me privately and I'll read it out. And then at the end, if the audience would like, we might ask you to read out your question yourselves to the panel. So we're going to start with the advice from our panelists. We've collected your pictures together into slides. So when you see your practice name on the screen, please unmute yourself and introduce yourselves with your names and your practice, and present each of your 3 pieces of advice with each picture. And I'll change the slides as we go. So this is going to be quick fire. You get a minute per slide, and I will be strict. So first up, we have Karls Enrich Studio. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi. Shall I start, or I mean?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So for us, this is like an example. This is a picture from this David Lynch movie, Mulholland Drive, which for us is like an example of architecture, or an example of our attitude towards architecture, because David Lynch had this commission to do a television pilot in 1999, and well, that project was rejected because it didn't have a good audience. So 2 years later, he filmed like an ending for that television pilot, and he did a movie combining both materials. So he reused the first idea or the first material, and then he made this strange movie, like combining these 2 walls between, like, I don't know, the part from the television film and the part from the movies, and then that for us it's like reusing a pre-existence and reusing the material, and also believing in himself, because he was rejected, but he went through all these ideas, and just he came out with this great movie. For us, it's one of the best pictures in the 20th century. So the advice for architecture is just to believe in yourself. And actually, this second idea, it's resilience, and joy. And this band is a punk rock band called NoFX from California, from United States, and they have been playing since 1983. They have been playing with the same songs, the same music, over like 40 years. They have been playing the same, and just they are there, resilient and joy. You have to enjoy. You have to fight a lot. This job, architecture, it's like a very tough job, but you have to be happy. You have to enjoy. You have to enjoy it. So for us, this is a good example, no? This punk rock band. And this last image, this is from a book called Lessons from Students of Architecture from Hermann Hershberger. And I also relate this with this sentence from Anne Lacaton, from Lacaton Basal, who what she said, that architecture is already there before the arrival of the architect, because it all has to do with the point of view. You have to see things before intervening, just to introduce the minimum elements to reactivate a place. This picture shows how a place, a residual place, can be transformed by only adding like 2 chairs and a small table. So for us, architecture at the end and urbanism is this, just looking at the site and try to reactivate, to transform it with the minimum elements. So the advice, or the conclusion of this advice for young architects is to believe in yourself, to be yourself, just to resilient, enjoy, and to look, and to try not to do the less things possible.
Thank you. Next up, we have Arigho Larmour Wheeler architects.
Hello. Hello, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yep. So we're Arigho Larmour Wheeler architects from Dublin and Belfast. And the first question was, what advice would you give yourself as a architectural student that you weren't told then, but you know now? And I suppose one of the things that was drummed into me as a student was that you had to try and find a concept or some sort of abstract theory to then project onto a place and create a piece of architecture. And what I quickly learned when I got into practice and working with De Blockham and Marr was that actually you didn't really need that, and simple things like light, view, local materials, tradition of building, and understanding how things connect together can make a really beautiful building or intervention into a landscape or an urban environment.
Sorry.
And we were asked about what we learned from being an emerging architect where we are. In Ireland, it's very difficult for a new practice to get larger work, and most practices start off working on family houses. So I suppose that we learned to find out, you should have confidence in their work and interests, and through collaborating, no project is out of reach. For this competition, for the Irish Embassy in Tokyo, we collaborated with a larger commercial architecture practice and found that we had a lot to learn from each other, and that we brought together complementary skills and interests. For example, our interest in housing and thinking specifically about smaller spaces on an intimate scale, and how living spaces connect throughout a house translated quite nicely into a much larger building. And to some extent, this building ended up feeling, having the intimacy of a large house. And we were encouraged by having the advice and backing of a hugely experienced practice on our side.
You asked us also what the best piece of advice we've been told and by whom we were given this. I was encouraged to do 2 things by my dad, an architectural historian, both of which are connected. He took me to see buildings firsthand, both here in Ireland and abroad, and encouraged me to look and think, to ask questions, and the importance really of experiencing places and spaces firsthand to really get a feel for the subtle nuances of how they feel and work. And as a practice, we go on study trips when we can to visit buildings together, and the shared references we make there find their way into conversations about our work together. This is something that's really important to us, particularly as we work from 2 locations in Dublin and Belfast. and the shared time together away from projects is really important. It's been more difficult over the pandemic, and being climate conscious, it's an increasing dilemma. But the other connected thing that he reminded me of was that we don't often have to go very far for inspiration, and that to look to the local vernacular to understand how people in a specific place have done things instinctively with the local climate and materials. And this is something we try to pass on to our own students.
Thank you, guys. Next up, we have Nomos.
Hello, I'm Ophélie, partner at Nomos in Madrid with Paul Galindo, and we have also Katrin and Lucas from another location, which are connected also to the session. So first question, what advice would you give yourself as an architecture student that you weren't told then, but now know? Okay, so when we started studying architecture, we were told that the dedication to architecture studies was going to be so great that we had to be prepared in a way to isolate ourselves from the world and work without pause. We would like to give ourselves the opposite advice. Like, do not disconnect from the world around you. Be extremely careful with resources and generous with ideas. Methodically doubt everything. And above all, be ready to accept the error as a companion. After the erasures and the rejections, sometimes a very clear line arises, an essential solution which gives a way to a new path that would not have been, that you would not have perceived before the error. Learn to live with the uncertainties that surround the architect's daily work. To illustrate this answer, we selected the Robert Rothenberg Erased the Koenig drawing, where the artist aimed to determine if a piece of art could be produced exclusively through erasure. Okay, next question was what is an important lesson you have learned about being an emerging architect, specifically where you are in the world? Okay, so we were shortlisted as emerging architects in a time of successive home confinements. This situation has revealed the spatial limitations of the homes in which we live, and we think we need to think about houses with more air, with different climatic conditions, with more intermediate spaces, and with more places designed to host unforeseen activities, moving away from the traditional housing program. Well, the image we have selected for that is John Lennon and Yoko Ono bedding for peace, that talks about this worldwide exposure of intimate space. And last question, the best piece of advice you have been told and by whom? So we're gonna share an advice we were given 20 years ago on a project jury by Emilio Tuñón. He asked us about two pillars that we had drawn in our plan, and he told us that two very close pillars can become one pillar that does not just want to be a pillar. At that time, we really didn't understand this advice. But nowadays in our practice, we understand that architecture is not just about finding rational solutions to specific issues, but about working on the unexpected. Which is the first step in the construction of a conversation with the person who's gonna experience your architecture. The image selected is a representation of the column base of the Saint-Nazaire Church in Carcassonne by Viollet-le-Duc. And it talks about the structural condition of the column, which has also a symbolic, cultural, and even a political condition. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have Studio Propolis.
Hi everyone. I'm Beth, and together with Naim, who's in Kenya today, I'm in the UK. We run Studio Propolis. So our first idea of some advice we would have liked to receive is quite simple, maybe kind of difficult to carry off, is to set some time aside every day to draw in a sketchbook. and there's so much inspiration around us, and drawing can really stimulate our curiosity and observation. And we love drawing when we travel, but there's almost also so much beauty to see around us in the everyday, and it can go unnoticed until we stop and draw it. The next one. Well, living and working a lot in Kenya, we've had to tropicalize our design thinking. And by this, we mean finding often low-tech solutions to the challenges that we come across in realizing our projects. And this involves hacking and customizing and adopting a more flexible make, do, and mend approach to improvise around everyday problems we find and use our workshop and to do that in our workshop and on building sites as well. And then the last one. Both Naim and I have been incredibly privileged to work with some amazing and inspiring craftspeople. And our given advice more specifically came from the prolific Indian furniture designer and Ganjanan Upadhyay, who Naim was privileged to work alongside a little bit. And he told Naim, you don't need to speak about what you do, but become so good at your craft, whatever that is, that people seek you out. Sorry, I lost it for a sec. Yeah, sorry, that people seek you out and find your work. So that's a sort of call for action to us to sort of strive to learn new skills that can expand the possibilities of what you can design and make, but also to rejoice in the idea of the anonymous designer and design that doesn't have to shout about itself too much in our kind of age of social media. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Bethan. And next up we have Surman Weston. Is that around?
Hi there. Tom Surman from Surman Weston here. Sadly, me and Percy can't be together today. So the first question, the advice that you wish you had been told and now know. And for us, I think what we've learned is being a good spatial designer is just a very small part of the full skill set required to realize good architectural projects. Working in practice requires countless other skills, patience, doggedness, optimism, the ability to find compromise, and being a good communicator. And for us, the image that encapsulates that you can see on your screens, this was a competition entry for a very small project back in 2016. And due to a large number of complications and challenges beyond our control, it's been very difficult getting this project to site. But 5 years later, and after lots of compromise, challenge, patience, doggedness, the project is finally on site this year. So it may not look exactly as it did in the model, and there's been changes along the way, but thanks to those qualities, the project will now finally be realized. Okay, and then an important lesson you've learned about being an emerging architect where you are in the world. We've consistently found that you can't do a good project without a good team, and your collaborators are just as important as your early spatial design work. So this image of the Hackney School of Food project really encapsulates that for us. From the client right through to the contractor and all the various other consultants on board, there was this wonderful team spirit on this project, and working within very challenging budgetary constraints. Everyone went above and beyond to make this project happen and make it a success. So for us, this image of the Hackney School of Food means a lot because it encapsulates the tremendous hard work and passion that the whole design team put into realizing the project. And finally, the best piece of advice you've been told, and by who. A former tutor of ours from our studies was adamant that you should not be afraid of making mistakes. Certain mistakes are inevitable when trying to be innovative, and we've made plenty of mistakes along the way, and although very painful at the time, we've learned from them all. And on the flip side, some of the risks that you take can go on to be great successes. This project, our cork study, was an example of us taking a risk. I think at the time it was the first project to be clad in these expanded cork blocks in the UK. We had to learn how to machine it and work with it. But by taking a few risks, if you like, it ended up being a wonderful experience, and now kind of a product that other studios are using a lot more frequently in the UK. So yeah, that's the final one.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, for all your great advice, stories and anecdotes. I must say my favourite line has to be Nomos's advice to accept the error as a companion. So I'm definitely going to take that one with me. And of course, Carlos's picture of a dining table set up between two cars at Asperger is definitely a favourite of ours at the AR. So now we're going to go to the floor for some questions. If people are able to and happy to, please put your cameras on and show us your faces. Also, don't forget to put your screen onto gallery view if you haven't already, so you can see everyone in the virtual room. You should be able to do this if you click on the top right view button on your screen. Panelists, please unmute yourself if you're in a fairly quiet surroundings, and we can try and have a nice and natural conversation. Feel free to come in at any time, and we'll see if we can avoid speaking over each other. It would also be really nice if any of the panelists have questions for other panelists. So keep this in mind, and yeah, interrupt with your own questions too if there's something that you just really need to know. So I'll kick off with a few questions, and then we'll see if we can go to the floor or to the chat for some from the audience. So I think perhaps I'd like to start with talking about the fact that in a lot of your advice, there was this recurring theme about embracing the fact that architecture isn't just kind of created or built or imagined into being by architects. And I wonder if there's anyone who wants to talk about the advantage of working with people outside the profession, and when this has helped you in a project and kind of helped to unlock something. Does anyone want to come in, or shall I pick on someone? Okay,
sorry. I was just going to say that, I mean, at the beginning of all collaborations, I suppose, starts with the client and trying to listen to them, because so often clients throw things at us that at first instance, you don't kind of, you know, you don't like, or you don't like what they say or they want, but it, you know, it opens doors to a whole different kind of way of thinking about what they need and what the problem is. And we don't operate like artists in isolation in a bubble, you know, and we depend on them. So for us, they're always our starting point.
That's great, thank you, Noam. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I think that exterior collaborators are basical in our job, because I don't know, archaeologists or anthropologists or designers, I don't know, everyone that adds something that sums up to this project. I mean, as Noam said, the client maybe comes with an idea, or the client or the city, if it's like a public competition, it comes with an idea, but our job, I think, is to try to be forward that idea, to give more than that idea, to implement that idea in the city or in the building or in this client's property, but try to do more than that. Try to just improve our research on that, in order to understand all the works, like continued, like in a line or something that it's repeating, and we are like trying to do something, not only just responding this client wishes. So at the end, it's very important to be very I know, just to be straight on that idea.
Great, thank you, Karls. Sorry, was it someone else about to jump in there? No, I'll keep moving. So Arigho Larmour Wheeler, I know you talked in your advice about how to kind of not worry so much about letting a concept drive a project, and instead to look at kind of like light view, local materials, traditions. And of course, Karls, in your presentation, you pointed out that the architecture is often there before the architect arrives. So I wonder, kind of on the same lines as the last question, if anyone can speak about a time in their practice where as an architect, they've had to step back and let others take over. And I guess here I'm looking more, less at other professionals and more about the community, the environment, what's already there before the architect arrived, and when the architect should be present and when they should step back.
Yeah, well, I think it's a little bit like the first question, isn't it? It's you know, what is there before you arrive? You know, you're given a site or an existing building to fix or to make bigger or to alter, and a lot of architecture in university, when you're learning and even in practice, is looking at the building and drawing the building. And I think maybe what you're asking is sometimes you should actually look from the building out. What is the building looking at? What's its context? You know, and respect that immediate context, and whether that's the light coming into the space where it is, or the proximity or the edge or threshold onto the site. I think that's really, really important to learn from, and to be inspired from, and to work as a start point, you know, maybe for a project.
Great, thank you, Mark. Does anyone else want to come in on that? So perhaps looking at the chat, I know Jonathan has some questions. Jonathan, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and we can talk about a bit of the debate going on in the chat.
Well, I was just sort of thinking in this discussion, the thoughts about being locals being mentioned, crafts being mentioned, and it was certainly mentioned in earlier presentations, and it's always been very strong in the Emerging Architects Awards. But does that continue when practices get bigger, when projects get bigger, or can it just carry on? It's just a question of how people think. That's really my thoughts. Is can it continue, or does it change? Do people lose the capacity to build locally when they get bigger and they get into bigger projects?
I think we should try to be on that, to maintain that first idea and to be local. I think it's very important to work in proximity, to be local, and then maybe if the office it's get bigger and we have more like this large scale project, maybe international projects, but I don't know, we should try to do them with the same idea, with the same process that we just came through the first interventions. No, I mean, it's very important to be I think to be close to the work, to the site, to know the people, to know everything that's related to the project. So in our case, for us, it's crucial to work in proximity and to be local. I mean, we are also doing some of these competitions. I don't know, outside this our more closer area, but we try to do them with the same ideas, with the same attitude.
I would add something else, because I think when we think about getting bigger, because we have more projects abroad, maybe, or because it's a bigger project, I think it's more about how you get bigger, no? If it's collaborating with other local offices and starting to create like a sort of community that you can understand the local problems without necessarily knowing exactly what are the issues, the materials there, but more about choosing and looking for people that can inform you, that can give you all the knowledge and start a conversation, because we have been working from like the last 5 years in a project in Burkina Faso, and this project has allowed us to know a lot of people from different cultural situation. Even a Spanish architect that was working there 7 years during 7 years, and a local architect, a woman that is collaborating with us for the execution of the project. And all this conversation is, I think, it's the thing that is allowing us now to build a project and to understand all the relation that we need to establish now to get a project done. No? So I think it's time. I prefer to understand that the office is growing not so much inside our structure, but more about establishing links and relations with different people, engineers, architects. We work with I don't know, with climatic engineers in Geneva or maybe in Barcelona, and all this conversation between people is making the project each time richer. So I think it's more about establishing all these links, finally these friendships and connection between people.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious to know, Karls, so obviously you've built very locally. I wonder if you would ever be interested in building further away or abroad.
Well, we actually are trying to do that, but I mean, I think it's this idea. I mean, trying to work with other local offices, or try to be like establish this link of like a network of very like maybe small officers like ours that work with the same attitude, the same idea. And even when we are just facing these different competitions or these different projects, we try to visit them if it's possible, or if it's not possible, to learn about the city, to learn about the people, to learn about everything. In fact, I think some years ago we were second prize in this international competition in Jakova in Kosovo, and the jury thought that we were local because we did like a great research on the city. We learn, we read a lot, we redraw a lot of plans, and the jury thought that we were a local team. That was an European competition, but it was nice to get that approach.
So we've got a few people with their hands up here. I don't know if Al, you want to jump in?
Yeah, the competition for the Irish Embassy in Japan posed this kind of question. It asked for a building in another country, but one that had some of the qualities or cultural representation of Ireland, which is a really difficult thing to think about and do, and sort of represent in a way that's really meaningful. And although we haven't had the chance to build something elsewhere, it was a really interesting chance to think about how you might do that in a way that wasn't that meant something. So for us, it was about looking to our own kind of sensibilities, preoccupations, and thinking about the typologies that we knew that we felt would make good space. And for us, it was taking this idea of the Irish Georgian townhouse and locating it on the corner of a park in Tokyo, which is quite an unusual occurrence there, and finding, these ways of thinking about landscape that we saw through the art of both countries, really. So I think it's possible. We haven't had the chance to build it yet, or build at that scale, but I suppose looking to the things that are more local and more familiar to you, and finding ways of translating those.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting.
Yeah, sorry, it was a project really that what Jonathan actually had mentioned there or asked about. You know, we examined smaller domestic spaces and tried to use that small scale project experience on a much bigger scale, because when, you know, no matter who goes into these spaces or buildings, they've all come from home. You know, they're all experiencing that domestic environment and
scale.
So, and scale, exactly. Yeah. So I think it's a really good question. I think that larger, bigger buildings should be able to have more intimate spaces, and that I think that experience, I would hope it will transfer across to the future.
Great, thanks. I see. I just wanted
to add the point. I wasn't saying, I didn't mean that the architects had to be local to their projects. It was more about the mindset and the feel of the project, which I think's been mentioned. I've got to be a little bit careful because I'm not an architect, so speaking to an audience of pretty much all architects. But just as an example, This is purely personal. Two Zaha Hadid projects, one, the Maxi in Rome, has a local feel in a way. Well, I think it does. Whereas the Glasgow Transport Museum, although it's completely covered in zinc, maybe doesn't quite as much. But that's just a personal opinion. So take that as you wish.
Thanks, Jonathan. No, that's really interesting because, I mean, as Carlos was saying in his competition entry in Kosovo, they assumed he was local. So it raises interesting questions about when we don't assume that people are local and what it means to be local. Naim, I see you've got your hand up as well.
A question for Nomos is, you know, like I also wholly subscribe to this idea of working locally. And the question is for you guys is, as architects working in Burkina Faso, how has your role as an architect had to change when you kind of collaborate internationally to make a local project in a way that doesn't mean that the client is just doubling and tripling up consultants because they often can't afford that. And so what have you had to deliver differently to create value differently and without doubling up different roles in different countries? We're really interested in knowing the process.
Okay, I think the way we're working, because we're still in the process. It's always we always understand it at the first time. We made a trip there to understand, not to know people who could be involved in the projects, to understand actively which were the resources we could use, which were in a way the people that we need to not I don't know if we need, but the people that we will help us to build, because we didn't help us to build the first ideas we had, no, but we would like to understand that, to feel that finally it's all the time, no, we have a local architect, we have an association, a humanitarian association that is located in Geneva, and that in a way all these kind of projects, no, humanitarian projects, are built, I think, from conversation between different countries, different people. So I think once we made this trip, no, we get back to the office and we start working closely with this local architect now. And I think we can offer her we can offer our skill now as architect, now as conceptual strategy, climatic strategy, and she can, in a way, we never felt that the conversation is just from not from our office to her office, but it's always going back back and forth. and it's even the tools we can have now, like WhatsApp conversations or Skypes, are quite are evolving quite fast and help us to communicate even in life during the site construction, resolving problematics or issues about the construction in a very short time. Even if it's very far, we can have this feeling of being, without being in the site, but almost being there, and we can all the time have a nice conversation about finding new solution. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know, the challenges that we really face when in this world of Zoom is being critical with people on a Zoom conversation is so hard, and it sets up this kind of democracy in the way you speak to each other that's really hard to be critical, and sometimes you do need to kill ideas, and it's super hard, and I don't know how to negotiate that better, you know.
Yeah, I think it'd be quite interesting to talk a bit about so the fact that obviously these awards were delayed by the pandemic, and so it's now been a year since we published all of your work in the AR, and longer since you entered the awards in the first place. And I was wondering, in this time, obviously, since we all had to stay home, spend a lot of time on our own, kind of different practices, being away from each other, atomized, weren't able to travel, but then also equally the plus sides of what we're kind of talking about the switch to like digital communication, and whether this opened up new worlds and possibilities for collaborations that could be richer in a different sense. I wonder if there's anyone who would like to come in and talk a bit about how in the past year the cause of the pandemic has changed their practice or altered it, or not changed anything.
Well, we've found that I think there are certain stages of a project that can be done okay remotely, and there are other stages where it's really, really challenging. As Naeem was mentioning there, I think the early design stages, when entering competitions and concept design work, we found that extremely challenging to do remotely. Just don't think there's a substitute for being sat around a table drawing and making together. But perhaps latter stages of the project where people have kind of gone off and they're running a technical design package or something like that, where it's more of a head down focused task that you don't need to be in and around everyone else for, can work. But it'd be really interesting to hear how others have found it. But we're kind of largely back in the studio now when we can be, and that's been amazing to get back together, and it feels like the quality of the ideas and the work is higher when we are in the studio.
Would anyone else like to speak on that?
I'll say something. Just think this last year, bearing in mind the kind of age of everybody and looking sort of down a little bit at people coming ahead, I think that idea of being together in collective has been incredibly difficult for architecture students in this past year. And I've been involved in a little bit of teaching and now back with students physically, and you can see the difference a lot. And just, I think really the point is that when you meet people physically, there's just so much extra that you can get out of conversation. And that goes with all sorts of collaborations, and for the students, you know, like feeding off each other's ideas and just seeing what each other is doing. But in terms of that idea of craft and collaboration and being able to scale up a little bit, like for us, we make a lot of stuff ourselves. So that scaling up involves bringing other people into that making. And that's such a physical activity that is so hard to do and be engaged in. And I think there are several people here also who are involved in that kind of very hands-on way of working on site or whatever it is, that you know, that this kind of virtual environment doesn't really promote that. So learning from each other, like what, you know, in real time, I think has been really difficult in this past 18 months or so. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Bethan. So we've perhaps got time for one more question. I don't know if there's anyone in the panel that wants to ask somebody else in the panel a last question. Any? Otherwise, I think we are going to move on to our next panel. So thank you very much for this panel, and congratulations to everyone who has been shortlisted, and of course to Karls for winning, Taya Capital for being highly commended, and Alex and Kafka for the Peter Davey Prize. Thanks also to our partners VM Zinc and Scale Careers, and to everyone else for listening. So next we are going to have part 3 of the Emerging Architects Guide, which is going to be chaired by Lily. So stay tuned and don't go anywhere.